suck it up and go into one of the most terrifying rooms in Lordran and finish our discussion on Priscilla and what it means for her to be the Darkmoon Goddess. So when we met Night Lord Trek of Karem up in Firelink Shrine for the first time after we released him, he gave us the Sunlight Medallion, and that represented the time that Gwyn gave Seath the Scaleless, the Moonlight Dragon, the sun. And at that point, Seath the Scaleless realizes what danger he is in. Gwyn destroyed all the other dragons. Seath could be next. So to keep himself safe, he needed to find some leverage over Gwyn. At the same time, the Witch of Izalith is realizing the ambitious nature of Gwyn. And so she realizes she also needs some protection from Gwyn. And so the two of them get together to create a weapon, Priscilla the Life Hunter. And then they give Priscilla to the most honest and conservative character in Lordran, Havel the Rock, because they know that Havel the Rock would never use that weapon against them. Unfortunately, Havel the Rock is not a very good protector, and so when Gwyn starts to advance on Priscilla, Seath is forced to take Priscilla from Anolondo and down into the Catacombs, where Nito can protect her from Gwyn, because if Gwyn was ever able to get control over Priscilla, the other lords would no longer have any leverage over him. So what makes Priscilla so terrifying? Not just to Gwyn, but to everybody else in Lordran. What is Life Hunt, and what does it mean to be the Darkmoon Goddess? The power of Priscilla is captured in the monster design of these wheel skeletons. They are persistent, they are agile, they are able to wear down your defenses, and then they are able to shred you to pieces. Notice that I must also try to get them up against a wall where they're turning around to try to hit them and destroy them. Now, just to recall the places that we've seen so far, and one place that we've heard about, the Darkroot Garden, Astora, New Londo, that we just heard about from Vermoose. What do all of those places have in common? They are all wet. They've all been flooded. So the light-devouring realm of Nito is trying to hide this ambiguous image from us. But I'll just put up a clearer one from earlier in the episode. And this very cool ambiguous image here that we've been seeing from the very beginning is a tower. But now if we look at that with the other images in mind, we can see a mother weeping, and those tears form a flood. And in Astora, there is a ramp in the room with the gaping dragon that looks just like the base of this tower. It is washing, that ramp of water is attempting to wash away the toxins of Astora. Which bring us to the Tearstone Rings, the two sides of Priscilla, and what makes her the Darkmoon Goddess. The rare gem called Tearstone has the uncanny ability to sense imminent death. This blue Tearstone from Katarina boosts the defense of its wearer when in danger. This ring was found in the Undead Burg behind the Black Knight with the sword. It is positioned in a place where it is overlooking the basement, overlooking the ruin of Lordran. And there is a second Tearstone ring, a red Tearstone ring, and this is found fittingly on top of a tower in a place called the Valley of the Drakes, also fitting. And the two Tearstone rings represent the two powers of Priscilla, the defensive power to hide, and the aggressive power to attack out of nowhere. And that's what made her so powerful and why the gods feared her. Seath the Scaleless created Priscilla, just like he created the Moonlight Butterfly, who rained havoc down on the witch Beatrice in the Moonlight Garden. He created Priscilla to be able to reset the world if the gods got out of control. And unfortunately for Priscilla, she does have to use her powers against her own daughter to wash away the toxins of Astora, against Menace to clean up the toxins of New Londo, and also in her own city of Ulsil, where Menace rears his head again. And that was the threat of violence that I was talking about all the way back in the Darkroot Garden. The peace that Priscilla kept. If people did not do as she told them to do at that point in time, she would reset the world. And Priscilla has reset the world in Dark Souls lore. It seems that she has reset the world twice, though whether this was a complete resetting or not requires me to do a little bit more research into Dark Souls 2. Because that's what we're seeing in the opening cutscene of Dark Souls 2. We see a character running through a forest, and then we see that character on a boat where there is just an island and a tree. And then they throw themselves into an abyss. And this is what Priscilla can do. She can wash away the toxins of humanity with a giant flood. And by Dark Souls 3, this is a preferable fate to the Age of Fire, according to some of the inhabitants of Lordran, and they have a covenant dedicated to bringing on the Age of the Deep Waters. And this is also connected to Priscilla's miracle, the Tranquil Walk of Peace. What the Tranquil Walk of Peace is doing is emulating someone wading through a river, but a temporary one that has been summoned by godly powers. But the difference between this and a real lake that we will come across, or a real swamp, is that it dissipates. And when it does, you return to form. You act as you were acting before. The sinners return to commit the sin of avarice. So while we're heading back, I can also mention another connection between the Tearstone rings and Priscilla. And it may answer another question some of you may have about the design of that ring. When your health gets low on either of the rings, you do not get an icon that is blue or is red. You actually get an icon that is purple with a silver outline, the colors of Priscilla, because these tear stones belong to her. And here we have Paladin Leroy, and he is an undead created by the Way of White. And now that he is undead, he serves Nito as a Grave Lord servant. And so he will appear here to help us with this boss battle we are coming up on, which is the boss battle of Pinwheel. And later on he will also show up to invade us, and that is because he is undead. He can show up multiple times. And Leroy is no longer associated with the Way of White and is instead a Gravelord's servant because his alliances have shifted. He came to the Catacombs when he doubted Gwyn's way, and what he saw here made him realize that the Way of White did not have the right answers for him. So here we are, crushing humanity in our hands, just as Patches thought we would. So another thing about Priscilla as we head back on down into the catacombs, notice the bleeding mechanic that these skeletons have. Notice that it can get through armor and shields. With one hit it does nothing, with a second hit it does nothing, but it builds up and builds up until finally you lose in one instance a huge amount of health. And if you had a low amount of vitality, you would die. And that is very similar to the act of asphyxiation, to suffocation, to drowning. And that is what the bleeding mechanic represents in this context, is Priscilla's ability to drown somebody, to get around their armor, to very slowly take their life from them, and there is nothing that they can do about it. So now we can also talk about the fact that Priscilla was represented symbolically in the opening cutscene. I mentioned this earlier when we were talking to Griggs of Vinheim. In the scene where Seath the Scaleless crushes the scale of the everlasting dragons, where he sees the sun rising, there is a storm above him. And this is why Priscilla is represented in that scene by a storm, because that's what she is. And that's what it means to be the Darkmoon Goddess. The Dark Moon is that storm. So to me it's not quite clear what part of Priscilla's power comes from Nito and what part she had innately within her. Whether her ability as an assassin was simply amplified by the Lord Soul that he gave her, which allows her to cast a miracle that wipes away the world. This is one of those things that I'm really not sure about. It makes sense to me, but I haven't been able to find any evidence of this. And things get a little bit muddier in Dark Souls 2 because Priscilla is renamed and pulled back from. And what she and the nature of her powers is kind of lost to time, it seems. So why the gods fear Life Hunt so much is best shown by this Black Knight here, who continues to haunt Lordran long after his service is no longer required. When the world is washed away by Priscilla, the gods of Lordran will continue to exist as hollow undeads floating in a sea of nothing. And that Black Knight there drops a Great Axe and a White Titanite chunk, representing Menace and his nature as a divine blacksmith. And so here we are, the battle with Pinwheel. So what is the theme of this battle? The theme of Pinwheel is Dark Souls, all of it, all of Dark Souls. Pinwheel is a visual representation of all the major themes of Dark Souls. All of the stories are being told with this one character design. The theme of cycles is represented by his moves. The theme of family is being represented visually in this character. And the theme of greed, the theme of the consequences of greed, is represented by his story. The necromancer Pinwheel stole Nito's power and claimed it as his own. And now he rules the catacombs. And that is why Nito must come up to the catacombs to drag the coffin of Velka down into the tomb of giants himself. And it's also why Paladin Leroy is with us. It is because Paladin Leroy wants to punish Pinwheel for his sins. And that intersection of Dark Souls themes can also be seen in the design of Pinwheel. What happens to the sinners? What happens to the family that commits the sin of greed? And not only will it happen once, or twice. It will happen 3 times. All of this is being shown in this boss battle. And it's a very quick boss battle, so hopefully we get to see all of those elements getting played out. Notice the 3 masks. Pinwheel is 3 people unnaturally stuck together. Notice that Nito can copy himself 3 times. This represents the 3 generations of Lordran, the original lords, their children such as Priscilla, and then their children such as Gwendolyn and Velka. Now that I've died, this gives me a chance to grab the cleric starting equipment that I missed earlier. And this particular starting equipment I would like to highlight because it's the one to me that most clearly signals that there is a logic, there is a story behind each of the starting class configurations. And this logic is communicated by the items that are omitted and added to the cleric's class. The starting class of the cleric does not have a priest hat, but gains the east-west shield. The priest's hat, distinctive hat worn only by way of white priests in Thurland. It is simply means to show their position within the hierarchy. It holds almost no meaning in the land of Lordran. So by omitting the priest's hat from the starting class of the cleric, the creators are clearly signaling that that class is not from Thurland. We also learn some extra information about Thurland, which is they have stuck to the idea of order, Wind's way, the way of white. But there's no power there. It's simply a hierarchy and a position within that hierarchy. Nobody in Thurland is a lord or a god or have any real power anymore. The holy robe, robed on by men of the cloth. Though plain to the eye, its hardy fabric repels rain and keeps the body warm. Those dissatisfied with church teachings must test their faith by going on a spiritual journey. Such is the ritual self-purification of the Way of White. And this item does belong to the cleric starting class, showing us this idea of self-purification rituals permeates throughout the history of the Way of White. Though note that the details of their journey are not specified. That is because they change as time goes on. Now the first paragraph of this item description is somewhat cryptic. A hardy fabric repels rain and keeps the body warm. This feels like a throwaway line until we combine this with the idea of Priscilla, the Darkmoon Goddess. The Way of White is a way of keeping Priscilla's cleansing flood at bay and keeping the flames lit, keeping the body warm. And those who doubt the Way of White should go into the Catacombs, go into the depths, go into the Darkroot Basin and see the consequences for breaking the order set down by the Way of White. And notice the clerics that start the game do not have holy gloves, they have travelling gloves. And that is because when these clerics served in the Way of White, they didn't need gloves. Instead, they used the Dark Hand. And that was because they served in the Way of White under Havel the Rock in New Londo when he was one of the great leaders of that city. Notice how theatrical Pinwheel is with his 3 masks. What he is doing is a performance. This family is not real. Also notice how his 6 arms create a circle representing the cycle. And notice that they all hold lanterns, the flames. So thank you to Paladin Leroy for helping us out with that boss battle. Notice here we just got the Rite of Kindling, that we'll talk about in a second. And also notice that even though that there are 3 people inside of Pinwheel's cloak, we only get 1 humanity, because those 3 people have become 1 person. Also notice that he also drops a homeward bone. Because Pinwheel's story is everybody's story, it's fairly easy to connect this back to the Taurus Demon and to Menace. So right now, let's just focus on the Rite of Kindling. And Pinwheel dropped the Mask of the Child, which is great because we could really use some extra stamina at this point. Now let's talk about the Rite of Kindling that Pinwheel just dropped. This allows us to feed further humanity into the fire and raise it beyond its normal levels. The Rite of Kindling. This secret rite allows bonfires to be bolstered further with kindling, so that even more Estus can be collected. Kindling was a sacred rite passed down among clerics, but all undead can imitate that process in the same manner that they restore their hollowing with humanity. How peculiar that humans had found a little use for humanity until they turned undead. And just notice there the visual design of the icon of the Rite of Kindling. There we can very clearly see a human being burnt alive. So at first the Rite of Kindling seems to belong to Nito. We're here in the Catacombs, seemingly Nito's domain. But we know now that the upper levels of the Catacombs belong to Priscilla and Velka. We also know now that Astora was where Velka reversed her hollowing to make herself beautiful, to seduce Manus. And then we also know that Velka sought revenge on Gwyn after he copied Astora, called it New Londo, took Manus, made him one of the great leaders of New Londo, and left Velka alone and with children. And the Rite of Kindling, which mentions allusions to all of this, is Velka's revenge. This is the secret rite that she gives to Priscilla, who then gives it to Gwyn, in an attempt to relight the first flame. To do what this ritual does. Take a soul, take humanity, and burn it. And extend the life of that flame, making it bigger and brighter than it was before, so that more Estus can be collected, more life can be collected. And that's what Estus is. Estus is life coming off of those bonfires. So then why is the ritual here, in this room? Notice these skulls. Notice the candles, just like the black candle that we saw in the depths, in the ruins of Astora. And remember that intelligence, Velka's domain, is marked by a candle. This room was Velka's room. This is where she studied when she lived in the Catacombs with her stepfather Nito and her mother Priscilla. And these books are where she got all of her information from, where she learned all of the sacred rites, which she learned many of, which she used again and again throughout the history of Lordran. So where did these books come from? To answer that is to bring some extra information from Dark Souls 3, but the ideas are here in Dark Souls 1. If we think about the black rats that represent Velka, you can see that their eyes are milky and glazed over. The rats are blind. Velka is also blind. This is why she is so fascinated by the dark. And that idea is here in Dark Souls 1, in the rats and in a few other places as well that we will get to. But in Dark Souls 3, the idea is really rammed home with the sacred tones of Lordran being all written in Braille, and the cleric that teaches you the miracles is blind, needing to translate the text for you, just as Velka had to translate these texts for the gods of Lordran. And there is also a section where books will damage you unless you have covered your head in wax, making yourself blind. And so now that we know that Velka is blind, there's a cool piece of trivia, but what does that mean for the books? It means that they were written by people who could not see. They were written in a time when there was little or no light. These books came before the time of the everlasting dragons. Now, this is different from my shared universe idea that I had before, because that was just me throwing out some wild speculation on From Software's creative process. But in lore, there was a time before the everlasting dragons, and Velka read and learned everything they wrote down before that civilization's last flame vanished. And so now returning to the Rite of Kindling with that idea in mind, the Rite of Kindling was found within these books. That civilization went on the same journey that the people of Lordran went on. They had a flame. They had flames that became imbalanced. Their flames faded. This is again a repeat of the idea of cycles, that the cycle isn't just within family, which we're seeing quite a lot of now. These cycles are also within the full cycle of civilizations rising and falling. And just notice an extra piece of detail here on the skull. Notice the third eye indentation on this skull. Oh, and one more thing about this room. Over here on this relief that runs all the way around the room, notice the small detail of an angel. This is a representation of Velka. Remember, she is a scaleless dragon. She has wings, just like her mother and just like her grandfather. And here is the light-devouring domain of Nito the Gravelord. This here is the Tomb of the Giants. And now to discuss a very important code, and this code is a lot like the color code that we saw at the beginning of the game in the character creation screen. And this code is formed out of the 3 masks of Pinwheel. So I'll just bring up those 3, even though we only got the Mask of the Child, so we can discuss all 3 of them at once. So here we have the 3 masks of Pinwheel, and these are the masks that were decorating these stone statues that we saw scattered throughout the catacombs. The Mask of the Father, the Mask of the Mother, and the Mask of the Child. And they are all given an adjective as well. So the Mask of the Father belongs to the valiant father and slightly raises equipment load. The Mask of the Mother belongs to the kindly mother who slightly raises HP. The Mask of the Child belongs to the naive child, slightly raises stamina recovery speed. And they all have a shared piece of text, and that is one of the 3 masks of Pinwheel, the necromancer who stole the power of the Gravelord and reigns over the catacombs. So the first thing to notice is that the masks form a family, the valiant father, the kindly mother, and the naive child. But what is also important here is that they are all masks. These are not permanent fixtures. These roles are not permanent. A naive child will become one day the valiant father. The naive child will also become the kindly mother. And in some cases, they become all 3. But as we've discussed, and what we've seen so far in Astora and in the Darkroot Garden, these names are somewhat sarcastic, they're somewhat ironic. Priscilla believes she is the kindly mother, but then she floods her daughter's city, she floods her own city. Velka also believes she's the kindly mother. Manus believes he's the valiant father, but then he leaves his children in Astora to be eaten. And then finally we have the naive child. But even though the child is meant to be naive, Velka knows a lot more than many others. The firstborn of Gwyn knows a lot more than many others. Even Manus, when he is considered a child by Gwyn, knows more than others. And this assumption of naivety is what leads to many characters being shocked that they are betrayed by their own. The children of Lordran aren't always naive, and Velka knew much more than many of the others, and that is why in Astora, when she wanted revenge on Gwyn, she took off the mask of the kindly mother that she was playing in Astora, and put on the mask of the naive child as she approached Priscilla with the rite of kindling. And so the skeleton wants to remind us about what we talked about all the way back at the beginning, the tumbling attack that the skeletons do. That represents the flow of water. That's why the skeletons are so agile. They represent Priscilla's powers to flood the world. And as we're reminded of that and we look at the mask of the kindly mother, you will see that she is weeping and her crown is crushing waves against a cliff. And finally, going back to the idea we discussed early on in this episode as we ended the Catacombs, the boundary marker that marks Gwyn's territory from Nito's, the rocks with the Elder Futhark runes on them. Pinwheel represents Gwyn's taking of Priscilla from Nito. The promise made to Priscilla for Velka to have a home with Menace, the man she loved. And also the promise that Gwyn gave Priscilla, a promise for something that Nito could not provide, more children. Nito was dead and was unable to have any children. And now I've been fairly nice to Nito all this time, but he is of course not innocent in all of this. He coveted a family, something that he could never have as first of the dead, and so he had to acquire it from somebody else. He took Havel the Rock's family and made it his own. But when Gwyn went to do the same thing to Nito that Nito did to Havel the Rock, Nito became furious. Nito turned on Gwyn and he turned on the Witch of Izalith, and the flame became unbalanced. Nito stopped providing the humanity of the dead, and so the Lord of Sunlight had to find another source. And in the words of Night Lord Trek of Kurim, most fools have more humanity than they know what to do with. Now who do you think will make the best use of it? And so, now that we've climbed back to the top of the Catacombs, it's time to call this episode. Hopefully by now, you have a very clear idea of who Priscilla is and how she's connected to so many other characters. Gwyndolin, who is her son, Velka, who is her daughter, Seath Scalers, who married her off to Nito, Havel the Rock, her first love and father of Velka, Gwyn, the man she was created to keep in check. Priscilla is the Darkmoon Goddess that in times of tragedy will come down and weep tears of sorrow to cleanse the world of its toxins. Or ensure red tears are shed by those who have preyed on the innocent. She is the lingering dragon, a subtle, pervasive force throughout Lordran, always in the background of many of the stories of those that once called this place home. She is the kindly mother, the prize so many coveted in Lordran, and the actions of those men who desired her beauty and or power are the reason that Lordran is in such ruin. Though of course all of this could be a masquerade, a charade that she's putting on. As some in Lordran come to believe she is a demoness that guides us all towards misfortune. So that's everything for today's episode. This episode has been quite a challenging one for me. But that's fine because the next one is going to be nice and simple. We're going to ring one of the bells of awakening. Finally, we will be going and facing the gargoyles. So I hope to see you all then. Bye.